Well, thank you very much. And may I say how pleased I am to have been invited and how disappointed I am not to be able to be in Oporto, a city that I have visited 3 times, a lovely city. I'm not flattering you, I so happen to think Portugal is the nicest of European cities, and I'm very sorry not to be there. The age of COVID, I'm afraid, has restricted us all with being pinged and other such pleasures. Now, I want to try, bearing in mind that there are a number of different ways of looking at this topic, I want to try to just first of all remind us all that nobody has a definitive account of the past. By the nature of things, the past, in terms of its causality, is an experiment we cannot repeat. We can try and affect the future, but we cannot, as it were, repeat the experiment of the past. So everything that I am about to say is, as I am well aware, tentative. It is offered in terms of trying to advance ideas rather than to assert or suggest that any one interpretation is definitive. And what in particular I want to put a question mark against is, as it were, what might seem to be the obvious answer. And the obvious answer, I suppose, is one in which in the 18th century we think of a readily obvious developing public sphere, and the national, whatever we might mean by proto-nationalism, whatever we might mean by nationalism, becoming part of the vocabulary, the methodology, the conceptualization, and the goal of that public sphere. And I'll start off by reading a quotation from a newspaper of that period that, as it were, might seem to represent that view. And so this is from the St. James's Chronicle of the 13th of May, 1769. And the author, in that period, newspapers, authors were either anonymous or pseudonymous. And this author was pseudonymous. He just referred to himself as an Englishman. And he wrote, "We are a people that should be often roused to a sense of our blessings and to the means of securing them. French clothes, French cookery, French literature, French plays, French shoes, and French hats have so possessed us from top to toe that if we do not guard against these encroaching refinements, we shall have even our immortal Shakespeare plucked from his eminence by French critics and degraded to the character of buffoon and drunken savage, which the spirit of envy and ignorance has been pleased to call him by the pen of Monsieur de Voltaire. While we can think and feel like Britons, we shall ever glory in the immortal productions of the greatest poet which any age or country has produced." Now, there's several obvious points to make about that very vainglorious statement. First of all, it postulates that there is a clear-cut people. Second of all, it presents a notion of cultural threat. Thirdly, it links this notion of cultural threat to a particular opponent, into this case, France. And lastly, it presents it in terms of a long-term challenge. After all, that's 1769. Shakespeare had been writing in the 16th century, nearly 200 years earlier. So the idea is, as it were, that there is a proximate cultural nationalism. That proximate cultural nationalism is expressed in the vernacular. Obviously, that's written in English. It's expressed in the vernacular, in the culture of print, newspapers available at relatively modest cost and relatively unregulated, and that it builds up a sense of a different people. And that, as it were, suggests a fairly obvious, fairly well-established approach to cultural nationalism. That cultural nationalism develops principally in Western Europe, though with outliers elsewhere, in the 18th century, that it very much develops as part of a growing public sphere, that the culture of print is closely related to that, provides the obvious means, and that, as it were, there is a clear sense of sort of often conflict with other agencies or other particular modes of identity. So that if in the particular case of Britain, and I'm not implying Britain is more or less important than other countries, it's just simply the one I know more about. In the particular case of Britain, or I should rather say England, because there are obviously different histories for Scotland and Ireland in particular, and to a lesser extent for Wales. So in the particular case of England, you have the argument would be a expression of cultural nationalism, a fashioning of the nation, in particular in the 16th century, as part of a Protestant Reformation, which in England produces a distinctive Protestantism, Anglicanism, headed by the head of state, as opposed to Lutheranism and Calvinism, which were much more international movements. That this is taken forward in the 17th century in constitutional, political, cultural, and ecclesiastical struggles between the Stuart dynasty, which is seen as more cosmopolitan, almost Catholic, and a kind of vibrant and innate English nationalism. And in the 18th century, this comes to fruition. And at the same time, although in much of continental Europe, there is still strong cosmopolitan tendencies, not least the way in which the Enlightenment is projected as a cosmopolitan tendency and movement. Nevertheless, there is also, partly as a result of distinguishing between nation and dynasty in many countries, and partly because of other political factors which we can talk about, there is also the fashioning of aspects of cultural nationalism. And that, I suppose, is where the conventional view would be. Now, like most conventional views, there is a lot of accuracy in it. And in suggesting slightly some other modifications, I am not implying that the conventional view is in some way wrong and that I've got a set of better answers. I'm just saying there are other things that possibly we ought to look at if we wish to think about fashioning the nation, which is my topic, in the 18th century. So let's start by moving to a totally and utterly different perspective. Let's start by pointing out that if we want to look at focusing the national in the 18th century, the European world was under a quarter of the world's population, probably, I mean, there's no reliable censuses for this period at the world scale, probably considerably less than 20%. And that really, if we're thinking in part about nationalism in 18th century contexts, it doesn't hurt to say a little bit about China and a little bit about India to start off with, each of which probably had about a quarter of the world's population. Indeed, Asia as a whole, although North Asia, Siberia was largely empty, if you include Southwest Asia, the Ottoman Empire, Persia, and Southeast Asia, Indochina, you would probably have, and Japan, of course, you would probably have about 2/3 of the world's population living in Asia in this period. So let's start with China, because China, in a way, is rather interesting, because China has, to a certain extent, some of the issues and tensions that you can see in Europe. First of all, however you wish to define China, the Chinese, there had been a long established state in what we would call China for a very long period. Now, again, not essentially unique in European terms. In European terms, if you're thinking of the 18th century, you would generally be looking for states like France or England, depending upon when exactly you want to start them, but roughly for a millennium. But in China, obviously, you've been going for longer. But 18th century China had had a recent experience which was not too dissimilar to that of a number of European states, which is that it had been taken over by a foreign dynasty. Just as England had had a protracted period of political turmoil, and indeed, since we are, discussing this as it were, we are in the intellectual space of Portugal. Portugal itself had not, between 1578 and 1668, not been without considerable turmoil of its own politically, and including, I think it's fair to say, elements of a foreign takeover after 1580. In the sense that, and this again pulls out a very interesting thing where the parallel with England is very instructive. You bring in a foreign dynasty, the Hanoverians in 1714, the Spanish Habsburgs for Portugal in 1580. They may well have the best dynastic claim. They may well be intermarried with and descendants of the pre-existing dynasty, but at the same time, they can be perceived as foreign. Well, in the case of China, of course, as you will be well aware, the Chinese dynasty that had been there since 1368 had been overthrown in 1644, the Ming, the last Ming emperor committing suicide as Beijing fell to the invaders. There was then a kind of Ming legitimist movement, particularly in southern China, until the end of the 1650s, beginning of the 1660s, but that is crushed, and a new dynasty comes in. And that new dynasty poses the question of how you define the nation in late 17th, 18th century China. The new dynasty is not ethnically Han Chinese. It is in fact Manchu. It comes from outside, north of the Great Wall. It's a steppe people. But, and this is interesting, the dynasty, as with previous dynasties that had come in from the steppe, and the one before the Ming was obviously the Mongols, had, as the term is, Sinicized. In other words, they had adopted, they'd fashioned the nation by the dynasty absorbing what were presented as and what it saw as the principal cultural attributes of China. And that varied from dressing as conventional Chinese rulers would have dressed, to encouraging means of address, in other words, how they are seen by both their new subjects, but also by their established subjects, and becoming, as it were, an established dynasty. The tension there is clear cut, but also the solution, and the solution being that what you really want to do is in some way to have a fusion of new dynasty and old state in order to command the legitimacy of rulership, a legitimacy that descends both from above. The ruler in China, like the ruler in Japan, has divine sanction and providential support, therefore, but also in terms of the consent of the people. Because, and this is constitutionally a very important point, even societies, or maybe particularly societies, which had no willingness to entertain any notion of the formal consent of the population, nevertheless had notions of good kingship, good lordship, stewardship on behalf of the deity, all of which presupposed that they were fashioning the nation in terms of dynastic legitimacy and in furtherance of the providential role of heaven. So that's, I think, what we could say about China. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that it is successful. There are, as you will probably know, one major pro-Ming rising in the 1670s, the rebellion of the three feudatories, so-called, from 1677 to 1681, a very big conflict. I mean, it's hilarious to think that we as Europeans think that our wars are the most important. In terms of scale, the biggest wars of the 17th century were all in China. As indeed, you will not be surprised to hear, that is true of much of history. But after that, there was no large-scale rising by ethnic Han Chinese. There were risings by tribal peoples, but tribal peoples were less than about 10% of the population. There was no large-scale rising by ethnic Han Chinese until you get the Taiping rising of the mid-19th century, which of course is the largest war of the 19th century as a whole. So China, as it were, the new dynasty has taken part in a process of fashioning the nation, which is in accordance with traditional patterns, and by traditional I don't mean good or bad, but just traditional patterns in which new dynasties come in and, as it were, incorporate themselves. And as you will be aware, the same thing had in effect happened in India in the 16th century when the Mughals had come in from what is now Afghanistan, overthrown the Sultanate of Delhi in 1526, created themselves as the new rulers of Hindustan, and then from there created a rulership which by 1707 ruled almost all, not quite all, but almost all of India. Now, the interesting thing to bear in mind here is you were fashioning a nation in the Indian case by taking over the pre-existing rulership, as indeed had been done on earlier occasions, but without any religious harmonization. The dynasty, the ruling dynasty, is Islamic. The bulk of the Indian population is non-Islamic. And there is no fashioning of the nation around a united religion or indeed any politicized language related to that. And that again is interesting because it underlines the variety of means by which nations can be constructed, sustained, aggregated, and indeed disaggregated. Now, as you may know, in 18th century India, you have a process of dissolution. The last of the great emperors dies, Aurangzeb. There are processes by which many of the regional rulers under the Mughals, the Nawab of Bengal, the Nizam of Hyderabad, become autonomous. There's a series of wars of, as it were, succession. There are foreign invaders, first Persian, then Afghan, and European powers are brought in. And I say brought in, they obviously try and exploit the situation, but they're also brought in by local rulers seeking their alliance. So in a sense, in the 18th century in India, you have an unfashioning of the nation. And the question then that emerges, and it's an interesting question, which is obviously not really politically acceptable to talk about in modern India, but is one worth thinking about because we tend to have notions of what we assume a nation is. But the interesting question is this: is what was being created in the aftermath of the fall of the Mughal Empire, as it were, new proto-nations in places like Bengal or Hyderabad, or for that matter, the Maratha Confederacy in Western India and subsequently the Sultanate of Mysore in southern India? Are these proto-nations, and is it the case that they would have been fashioned as successful and sustained new nations, each of which incidentally would have had a population larger than that of any European state, because India is a subcontinent as much as a country? Or should we see it as obviously the case that the national scale is, as it were, fixed? There are clear-cut countries, and therefore when we're looking at the question of fashioning the nation, we need to think about how to sustain identity at that level and to treat everything else as a kind of unwelcome, almost psychosocial or antisocial fashioning at a sub-regional level. And if I might bring that point on, if you're thinking about the European world in that context, you could argue that one of the biggest changes in the long 18th century in fashioning nations in the European world in the long 18th century is the dramatic increase in nations in the European world after 1775, and more particularly after 1820, as European empires in the New World collapse, are overthrown in whole or part. And what you therefore end up with is obviously the first two independent countries out of the bloc are very differently, but it's what becomes the United States and it's Haiti. But then what you've actually got, which is much more interesting in some, those are both fascinating, but much more interesting in some respects, is Spanish America. Although there are attempts to create states from Spanish America that are larger than what eventually becomes the nation. So for a while, Central America, north of Panama, is all linked in with Mexico. Panama, which is part of Colombia, and Venezuela and Ecuador are all one nation, etc., etc. In other words, there are a smaller number of nations than eventually emerges. Nevertheless, there is a disaggregation of Spanish America. So what you have is a whole series of new nations fashioned, each of which have, as it were, a similar origin myth. Reaction against Spanish rule, a similar language for the elite. Many of the bulk of the population are, of course, people of a very different ethnic minority and ethnic identity and practice, but there is a Hispanophile elite. That Hispanophile elite, largely people of European descent, largely Spaniards, all Spanish speakers, all Catholics. And yet there is, despite that similarity, they actually present a whole host of different nations. Now, where am I going with this? Because we're now going to be talking about just simply about Europe, and more particularly about the British Isles, and more specifically about England. Well, where we're going with this is to suggest that we have to be cautious, very cautious, about assuming either that there is a dominant European narrative on the global scale, or even a dominant European narrative within the European world. Why, after all, should Brazil or Peru or Mexico be regarded as less important in terms of considering how nations are fashioned in the long 18th century than England or Spain or Portugal? So that's one point I'm going to make. Second point I'm going to make, and linked to that, is that we know, with the benefit of hindsight, that in old Europe, I've just been talking about New Europe, that in old Europe, most of the nations within which national sentiment is to be voiced are to be sustained into the mid-19th century, if not in many cases, though not all cases, longer, and in some cases, like Portugal, to the present day. But we also know that that was a kind of luxury, of assumption, that was not present to contemporaries. After all, the British might please themselves to assume that they had some call on providence, secular or religious, but the fact of the matter was there was no reason why Napoleon shouldn't have actually succeeded in getting his troops across the Channel in 1805 and brought to an end independence for England, just as in 1805 he was to get his troops into Vienna and 1806 into Berlin. And if you look at a map of Europe in 1811, you will notice that most of the identities cartographically and most of the nations that had been linked to them were being refashioned at the least in a kind of French hegemony. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm not I'm just talking about this as a historian. I'm not trying to get involved in some sort of modern debate about the rights and wrongs of people in the past. But what I am saying is that if you had sat there in any decade of the pre-French Revolutionary period, obviously the pace of change rises dramatically from the outbreak of the French Revolutionary Wars in 1792, and more particularly the failure of the counter-revolutionaries to suppress the revolution that year. If you go earlier than that, there is similarly periods of enormous uncertainty in European history. For example, if we're just looking at the 18th century itself, what the fate would be of the Spanish Empire in the 1700s, what the fate would be of the Swedish Empire in the 17 teens in face of the apparently inexorable rise of Russia under Peter the Great. Russian forces by the winter of 1716-17 were in Jutland in modern Denmark. Russian forces by 1735 were in Germany. Why on earth you should imagine that the world was not going to change? And indeed, my favorite historian, Edward Gibbon, asked the question in Book 4 of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which, if you've never read it, is not actually about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. That's just part of it. It's actually a history of the world up to the mid-16th century. But he asks the question, could it happen again? And the question he's asking is, could barbarian invasions, I'm not in any way using the term barbarian in a pejorative sense, he uses the term barbarian, could barbarian invasions bring down Europe? Now, Gibbon, being an interesting man and a clever man, he was also a member of Parliament, writing at a time when Britain's empire was collapsing in the face of the American rebellion, whatever you want to call it. Gibbon answers both ways. He says, well, probably not. He thinks the change of Russia, he sees Russia as westernizing, and the development of cannon mean it less likely. On the other hand, he also says, well, yes, it could happen. And if it does happen, it doesn't really matter, because in his terms, I'm not taking, we would regard these as racist assumptions. I'm not taking those in that sense. But in his terms, civilization has been reborn on the other side of the Atlantic, in, as it were, diaspora colonies, some of which are now going for independence. And therefore, and he also refers to Captain Cook's voyages to the South Seas, and therefore, it doesn't really matter what happens to Europe. Now, we can move aside from that, the idea of, as it were, the old established idea of the transition of empires. We can move aside from that to make a more general point that there is an acute sense of volatility in this period. And as I said at the outset, one of the ways in which identity is shaped is in part in response to that volatility. That does not necessarily mean it has to be xenophobic. The quote I gave you from the London newspaper was clearly xenophobic, and there is a language of xenophobia that you can find in some London works of that period. Edmond Dzumbuski's book, very interesting book on French thought in the 1760s, makes the same point about France in the 1760s. There is obviously, you'd exactly expect that. There is in part a shaping of nationalism around xenophobic principles. And Linda Colley, in her book Britons, argued that anti-Frenchness and anti-Catholicism were part of British stroke English nationalism, and similar arguments could be made for other countries which have, so in Poland you could argue that anti-Russian sentiment was part of the nationalism of the late 18th century. That is obviously an element, and one would be foolish to deny it. But at the same time, what I would suggest to you is that there is a process by which the very need in a situation of volatility to feel some kind of identity in part is the way in which nations are endlessly reshaped. It's not as if in the 18th century you were having shaping from new. Concepts of the nation had been there earlier, as you know. One of the backgrounds to Martin Luther in the 15 teens and 20s is writers like Ulrich von Hutten writing proto-nationalist stuff, in fact, looking to Arminius, the alleged leader who defeated the Germans at the Tittenberger Wald in AD 9, and writing about them and seeing people like Landgrave Philip of Hesse as a kind of German hero, in part, again, because of a sense of volatility then. Not surprising, enormous volatility. The Ottoman advance in Europe, a period of economic, demographic turmoil, a period of enormous political uncertainty. It's not surprising that people against this background at that period also sought to refashion their sense of themselves. So what I would suggest for the 18th century is it is not that the intention is new. What is, in a sense, somewhat different, and in my view, it gathers pace more in the 19th century as mass education, particularly the second half of the 19th century, as mass education systems encourage greater literacy. What is instructive in the 18th century is from roughly the 1740s, the European population is rising. There is, in many parts of Europe, increased readership and increased levels of literacy, particularly for men, and obviously it isn't universal. And these provide opportunities to express new views, but that is not the only way that what we might call the nation could be fashioned. And some of the fashioning of the nation is distinctly unappealing and unattractive. You can look at parts of Europe, Ukraine is a good example, in which fashioning the nation, if you wish to use that term, in part is a matter of taking part in atrocities against those who do not fit in to your concept of the nation. Religious minorities such as Jews, or religious minorities such as Uniate Christians, Uniate Catholics in Western Ukraine, or for example, the enormous peasant risings in Transylvania in 1784 or in Bohemia in 1775, in which, in essence, there is an expression, a fashioning, which one might link much more to notions of blood and soil that we are more traditionally apt to identify with the extreme right in the early 20th century. So we have to be very cautious of assuming that fashioning the nation is necessarily a benign, enlightened, or cosmopolitan project. I wonder if I could close, and I hope then there'll be time for questions. I'm not quite sure how this machinery works. I wonder if I could then close by making one or two specific comments about the British Isles. First, and obviously the case, there are a number of different nations that you could fashion and that had existed in the British Isles. That the, as it were, violence was a key way in which the process is established in the 18th century, whether the violence of the suppression of the Scottish Jacobites in both 1715-16 and 1745-46, or that of the Irish rising of 1798, each of which are similar in that each of them involves a civil war. The majority of the army of the British state at Culloden in 1746 are loyal Scots killing Highland Scots, but also a matter, if you like, of English pressure on the other parts of the British Isles. And either of those 2 points can be emphasized. And there was a habit of English writers, English commentators, to think that when they said English, they meant British. whereas there was a habit of those elsewhere in the British Isles to be aware that there was quite a clear distinction. And that captures one of the elements of shaping nations in the 18th century, which is that in many nations there were multiple layers of identity. If you lived in, let us say, Hanover in 1750, you were a subject of the Kurfürst, the elector, who was also king of England. You were almost certainly a Lutheran. As such, you would owe your identity in part to being a Lutheran. And as a member of the Lutherans, you would be part of the Corpus Evangelicorum within the empire as a whole, as it were, the League of Protestants. And you'd also be a subject of the Holy Roman Empire, which had a number of jurisdictional facets, and whose head was for most of the century, with one brief exception, the Habsburg, a Catholic, and the brief exception was Karl Albert, Charles VII, who was a Wittelsbach, Bavarian Wittelsbach, and also a Catholic. So you have a multiplicity of identities. You have also, therefore, a multiplicity of identities that are capable in Britain. And shaping the nation in part rests on trying to get these differing identities to articulate. And one might argue that that remains a challenge for modern political entities, whether they are explicitly federal, the European Union, for example, or the United States, which are explicit, or Australia, which are explicitly federal, or whether they are implicitly federal and muddling their way along, which I suppose you could argue is true of states like Britain or Spain today, each of which have greater problems because they find it hard to address this issue of multiple identities. So one of the points is that shaping the nation doesn't have to lead to any particular outcome. In most nations, it's a matter of the fundamental political skill, the skill of just keeping the show on the road, just keeping going and trying to cope with what could go wrong and what is going wrong. Now, in the meantime, of course, in the 18th century, among those who are literate, there was a greater publication of texts and other means that sought to, as it were, provide a cultural identity of nationhood. So one can think, for example, in the case of England, and here, obviously, the work circulated more widely in Britain, and many of the key writers and publishers, incidentally, were Scottish, but the English still called it England in their terms. You could think of the way in which the dictionary is codified to a considerable extent. Dr. Johnson is the most famous figure there, but he's not the only figure there. You can think about the 6 major editions of Shakespeare. You can think about works coming out to show you how to spell better, to show you how to write better. You can think about people writing books about the geography or history of their country. In the case of England, the late 18th century saw all the world and their friend write histories of England. The great Methodist Samuel Wesley produced a history of England. The great Scottish novelist Tobias Smollett produced one. The great Scottish philosopher David Hume produced one. The great Irish writer Oliver Goldsmith produced one, etc., etc. Jane Austen produced one, though she didn't publish it. So in other words, this attempt to try and fix senses of nationhood, or at least to articulate them, was important. But we have to be wary of assuming that there is any progressivist stance here. That's what I would be very cautious about. I would say that you have to be very careful of assuming that, as it were, the Enlightenment project, which we would all like, we have to be very cautious about assuming that it necessarily describes all those involved. We have to be very careful about assuming that Enlightenment complaints about those of other values, particularly who were regularly written down as superstitious, we have to be very careful about that. If you're looking at English writing, Scottish writing of the 18th century, you have to note, for example, that many of those who we might see as progressive figures had pretty hostile views towards Catholicism. And we have to be very wary about assuming that in some way that was a progressivist account. So what I am trying to do is to suggest that shaping the nation was complex, that it was contingent. I also want to point out on my very last comment that we end the 18th century with two major British nations. In Old Britain, there is about to be the Act of Union with Ireland, and there is going to be a parliament in Westminster that has oversight over the whole of the British Isles and the British Empire. But already a new as it were, as Gibbon would have noted, a new nation is being shaped on the other side of the Atlantic. And the very fact that within 62 years, that nation is to collapse into a most horrific civil war shows the difficulty of actually constructing and shaping a nationhood in that period. And it is no different today. Many thanks. Happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you very much for such a brilliant talk on such a wide range of subjects that has taken us from Britain to China and India, and then back again to the so-called Western Hemisphere. And I'm very happy to say that, fortunately, technology has allowed us to have you present, as it were, during this conference, even though we've been faced with the COVID restrictions that you mentioned at the beginning. We do have time for some observations, a few questions, if anybody from the audience would like to make them. I will have to relay them to Jeremy Black, I'm afraid. Because I don't think that he'll be able to hear what you say, but I will do my best, please. Yes, please.
Yes, I'm just wondering what you would think about the relationship between nationalism as an ideology and the state being tried being increasingly nationalised. In a sense, I think there's a distinction to be made between the discursive talking about being English or being French and being an English or French nationalist. And I wonder to what extent this hasn't fully taken hold in the 18th century, but also so more than anything.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. First of all, I think there are very, very few what one might term nation states. I mean, in a sense, if you're thinking about Britain, you've got a Hanoverian ruler who, up till 1755, which is George II's last visit to Hanover, would rather be in Hanover than he'd be in Britain. And yet he's the head of the government, the head of the armed forces. In the case, France is closer to a nation state, I think it's fair to say. In the case of Spain, I would argue the nation state is relatively poorly developed, as indeed is the case today. If one goes to Barcelona, one will be very much aware of that. I think in the case of Portugal, I think you could fairly say there was a nation state in the 18th century. Yes, I think I would say that. But I wouldn't say there were nation states in the German or Italian lands. But there was still, I would say, a sense of nationalism in the German and Italian lands. And there was still a sense of nationalism, definitely in England, definitely in Scotland. But I've just been writing a book about, well, I've been writing several books, but one of the books I've been writing about is about Tobias Smollett. And Smollett was a Scottish younger son, doctor, born in 1721, goes to live in London, pursues his career there, in part actually serves in the Royal Navy, dies finally in 1771. He was always passionately keen on his Scottish identity, but at the same time, he saw himself as aligned to Britain. But he has his characters like Roderick Random, the protagonist of his first novel, who is a Scot in London, who is being vilified because he is Scottish. Now, I'm not quite sure where we're going there in terms of what is a nation state. I mean, if I look at where I live today, I'm a Londoner. I've spent virtually all my career outside London. Is the fact that most people, if you ask them elsewhere in England, let alone Britain, they're pretty uneasy about London, they're pretty uneasy about Londoners. Is that any compromising of a nation state? I don't know. I think it's more that there are a multiplicity of factors. So I think there was nationalism and a nation state, but also anti-statism as quite a powerful constituent factor in 18th century Britain. That doesn't really answer the question, but I'm uneasy about the nation state for the 18th century. It doesn't really ring right to me in those terms.
So the point is, to what extent you were claiming that a sense of national identity is related to a sense of instability or uncertainty about the present and the future?
Well, I certainly think that is a role. I don't think it's the only role. I don't think, for example, that people pushing forward education in the vernacular are necessarily doing so because they're angry about international competition. But I certainly think that there was a degree to which, if you're looking at the period 1790 to 1815, opposition to the French Revolution, to radicalism associated with it, and then subsequently to Napoleon, all encouraged a degree of what we might call cultural nationalism. Certainly the case, I would say, in Britain, certainly the case in some of the German lands. But again, you have to be careful. If you're looking at Germany, large numbers of Germans, particularly Bavarians and Saxons and Württembergers, served in Napoleon's armies. And the so-called German War of Liberation of 1813 was in many senses a Prussian attempt to grab sort of influence and power, and it had to be enforced in part with the threat of the advancing Russian forces. So I think one always has to be wary of these things. I agree with the lady completely that that is an important element, but I think one always has to be careful how one exactly plays it out in causal terms. And remember, for many nationalists, internal divisions are often the key political element. So in other words, narratives of nationhood are often shaped in part against those domestically who are disliked or feared or resented or none of those, but just are there. I mean, you might argue that that's one of the elements that's been happening in politics in a number of countries, including Britain, over the last 5-6 years. And you might argue that actually, it's not my job to talk about modern British politics. I could do that on many occasions, but it's worth pointing out that a lot of the political debate in Britain has been not so much about Brussels, but it's been about British people having nasty things to say about other British people, and obviously more sophisticated analysis than that. So in other words, it's a lot of politics is internal division. I mean, I used the point about American nationhood. What you actually end up with in 1861 is two American nationhoods competing within a nation state. Now, you could argue that that what you've actually got is a nationalism that doesn't work, or you could say it only doesn't work in the very short term in a specific political crisis. You can take both points of view. And again, I could certainly discuss that with you if you wanted. I think at all stages, what I would urge is caution. And I'm not sure, what worries me at the present moment in so much historical discussion, both within the academy, but also more generally in civil society, is that people rush to have an answer. And that's why I started off by saying, it's very difficult to work it out. We don't know what the majority of people thought in the 18th century. We don't know what the majority of literate people thought. We don't know even, if you've got books, how much are they influenced by those specific books? We don't know. There are all sorts of issues to discuss, which to my mind makes it more interesting, not less interesting.
Okay, it's actually a double question. First, what role does chance play in history? And second, what is the relationship, if any, between money, capital, on the one hand, and nation building on the other?
Oh, how interesting. First of all, if I may take the latter one. Wait a minute, we're about to get the grandfather clock to strike the hours. There we go. Sorry about that. Right, second one. Let's take the second one first. Clearly, capitalism is important to the industrialized element of nation building from the late 19th century onwards. I don't think there's any doubt about that the tax revenues produced by newly developed industrialized economies enormously enhance the potential of states to enforce legislative programs like building schools. I'd be a bit more cautious for the 18th century. In the 18th century, a lot of the capital networks, Huguenot exiles, the Genevan-based banking circles, British links with Portugal, for example, are often spanning what we might call different states. So I'd be a bit more wary of that in the 18th century. Obviously, business is much less well developed in the 18th century than it's to be by 1880. As far as the first one is concerned, yes, the speaker is absolutely right. I do put an emphasis on chance and contingency, and that's a major weakness of my work, but it also reflects where I'm coming from intellectually. I'm not saying that's the only way to look at things. That's just the way I tend to look at things. But the problem is that in asking questions about patterns, I end up with the risk that history just becomes one thing after another. So I agree with what might be an implicit criticism there, and it was phrased very kindly.
But at the risk of some overlap with previous questions, considering the range of issues that you raised, what is special about the 18th century? What is its specificity? Where does it stand in the course of history?
Well, first of all, I'm speaking on the 18th century in part because you asked me for it too, but I think all periods of history must be interesting to the historian. But why am I interested in the 18th century? In part because I see the 18th and the 19th century as the origins of the modern, and we live in the modern world. I'm interested in that. In part because and linked to this, much of the vocabulary of our world comes from the 18th century, in part because I think I can engage with more of the people of that period, in part because I am personally secular, and I think you get a secularity in the 18th century. I don't mean by that people weren't religious, but what I mean by that is that providentialism, so that the religious, like the non-religious, tended to be less providentialist in the 18th century and more to have the notion of a, as it were, an indirect determinant on specific actions, indirect divine determinant. And lastly, because I really like the, as it were, the intellectual energy of that period. I would think it would have, I mean, I would have been dead because I've had my appendix out when I was 21. I would have been killed in that period. You couldn't have done it successfully. So I don't have any romanticism. And of course, I would certainly not have been one of the affluent. But I do think it must have been so exciting to live in Dublin or Edinburgh or London or Paris or Amsterdam or Frankfurt or Hamburg, Milan, you know, a whole host of places in the 18th century, which were, I think, seething with a kind of energy of new ideas, and also trying to engage with fascinating new problems. I mean, how do you respond to the discovery? I mean, they didn't need to be discovered, they knew they were there. How do you respond to the, you know, to, as it were, European interaction with the Pacific, as it were, from the European perspective, the dark side of the world? How do you respond to these host of new sciences which are coming through, sociology, economics, geology? I think it must have been absolutely fascinating. But you know, that's just my personal view. Can I just say to the audience, I'm really pleased. I mean, you know, I've retired. When you retire, I mean, I didn't particularly want to retire, but, you know, you reach a certain point and there you go. There's no tenure in Britain. Out you go. I'd been doing it for 40 years and, you know, my time was up. And to be fair, they create, you know, a job opportunity was created for somebody younger. So that was good. Very good. I'm pleased about that. But one does miss a lot of intellectual engagement. This is the first time I've spoken on this topic, and it got me thinking. And one of the things I really would urge people who are planning to retire or going to be made to retire is to try and keep in with networks of other academics, because it really keeps your mind going. So thank you. I hope on a future occasion, when COVID is just simply like flu, something we just take a, you know, a jab for once you know, I mean, quite frankly, I'd have a jab once a month if they offered it to me, to get the chance to come to Oporto again, because I think it is a wonderful city. And by the way, you didn't mention one of my books, and that was that among my Nation series that I have published a history of Portugal. Anyway, thank you very much.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much.